we want to turn to a very, very important issue as we get into the school years beginning all across the country here, and that is the teacher shortage and the overall crisis in public education in the United States. And we are very honored to be joined for this conversation by Natalie Rizzi, who's a public school teacher, public school librarian, and currently the vice president of substitutes with the United Educators of San Francisco. Natalie, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me on. It's really exciting to talk to you both.
Well, we're really excited to have you. I think a lot of people, certainly anyone with kids, has been hearing about this issue of a teacher shortage in the United States as we go into the fall here in the new school year. And, but I know there's also now some pushback saying there is no teacher shortage. And that seems ridiculous, but there is pushback, I guess. So maybe just to start, give us some sense of what districts are facing, your district and elsewhere around the country in terms of going into this school year vis-a-vis appropriate staffing.
Yeah, I'll speak to specifics of the district. So I teach in San Francisco Unified School District and and elected to represent. It's a pretty urban district, not huge, right? We serve about 48 to 50,000 students with about 6,200 educators. And we were starting the year off hundreds of educators short. And there is a distinction to be made. I think people talk about teachers a lot, but there's a lot of people who work in education. So we were over 140 teachers short, but then almost 200 paraeducators short. And paraeducators play critical roles, one-on-one student work, security, family work, all sorts of different roles are played in the education world by paraeducators. So that's hundreds and hundreds of workers who, are not able to serve those kids. And I think that our experience is probably replicated across the country. In some places it's much worse, in some places it's slightly better, but we are definitely seeing that trend across the country.
And no, indeed. More than 500,000 teachers have left teaching in the last year and a half. I'm curious if you can maybe talk a little bit about why there is this teacher shortage now. Obviously, a lot of this has to do with COVID and what happened after the pandemic, but this is also a part of a decades long, I think, attack on public education. And maybe the pandemic was kind of the last straw for a lot of people. But can you speak to why so many teachers have left the profession in recent years?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think you hit the nail on the head. The pandemic was this expansion of what we were all already experiencing in public education. And I'll speak to the pandemic first. What we experienced as educators in the pandemic was that for the health of our communities, for the health of our families, we pivoted and began to do education in a way no one had ever considered it before. And educators, it was exhausting, it was demoralizing and alienating in a lot of ways. So just that experience within the pandemic was very, very challenging. And it came at a time with very little political support and often political attacks as the pandemic carried on. And the government provided no real support for individuals. What we really saw in our schools, we see it in the Board of Education races and the way educators were spoken about. I think people turned on each other. They turned, right? That real angst and anxiety became something that we then had to contend with as educators who are trying to do our best in a very difficult situation. And I could speak about that for a long time, but I think what it did was made, sort of heightened a demoralization and a feeling of a lack of respect for a profession that you go to college for and then you go to additional schooling for, and you come out with quite a bit of debt. And you're in that situation as an individual and you're experiencing it. But what you said about the last 10 years, and I would argue even longer than that, is that there has been a sustained attack on public education since the late 80s. It was really, started in the late 80s, but rolled all the way through, and we experienced it in the attempts to underfund education, to promote charter schools, to pull kids out of public education, and really as an attack on our unions, which is the collective voice of our educators in those spaces that speaks not just for us, but for our students as well. And we've seen that develop. And that attack on public education has led to a place where I'm sure everyone's seen, the map of teacher pay penalty. where Colorado teachers are paid 35% less than the rest of the country. Here in California, it's more like 16 to 17%. But this idea that your other college educated professionals are being paid far more in wages and compensation than you are for something that people value. Everyone loves their teachers. Everyone loves, you have teachers who were really important to you. Every time we go and do political lobbying, that politician says to us, well, my mom was a teacher, my cousin was a teacher. Everyone loves their teachers, but the society we live in doesn't actually invest in public education or the educators that make it happen.
I think that's such a good point, because I think it really puts it into context. I mean, sort of what we value as a society and what it says about the politics of a society that we could even be here. I mean, and of course, this the enemies of public education are always saying, oh, these teachers are just greedy. Oh, they're doing this, doing that. But, one thing I always say to people when they're talking about, oh, I hated this thing on CNN, I hated this thing on Fox, I hated this thing on MSNBC, is I'm like, well, just think about that talking head and know they make 100 times more than any teacher in America. And people are always like, wow, I never thought about it like that. But it's sort of like the warped reality where it's like teachers are greedy somehow and schools are taking too much money. But no one's ever saying, isn't it weird that we're paying some random person like Chris Cillizza or Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson $20 million, $10 million, $15 million to just randomly talk about things on TV. I mean, it really does feel like so much of the rhetoric against teachers and against public schools is really rooted in this idea that somehow public services, social good is pernicious or something. I don't know. I'm rambling, but maybe just your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point. I mean, we spoke out at the Board of Education meeting just this last night. I'm forgetting what day it is, but it was last night, or 2 nights ago, sorry. And, we had paraeducators get up and talk about what it's like to live in San Francisco when, the cost of living is so high that you really need to make like $39 to $45 an hour for a living wage. We're not talking 15, like more than twice that. And paraeducators make, $24,000 to $28,000 a year, and they're trying to do their best, but they can't even live, not only in the communities their kids live in, but the city that their kids live in. And then what does that mean? And the idea that teachers get into this for the money is such a falsity. It should be laughable. No one should be able to repeat that without just being ridiculed, because it's never been true. But at this moment, I think what we're facing is that the crisis in public education can be turned around. Like, it could have been turned around 10 years ago, but no one did anything about it. The de-investment in public education, the de-investment in colleges that educate teachers, those were all things that were happening. And the only thing that shifted it actually were the 2018 teacher strikes. That was when the whole de-investment started to shift, but it was so late. And now this crisis is so present for everyone that I think we do have an opportunity to change the crisis. And, the teachers unions are at the forefront of that struggle. The Columbus, Ohio teachers are on strike right now. And when you look at what they're asking for, it speaks to this. It speaks to revitalizing and stabilizing our educator population so that we can be in the classrooms with our kids, teaching at a very, very critical time for everyone, for an entire society. The pandemic is not over. Of course, we see that, but we are able to be back in the classrooms. We are able to be fully present with our students and our communities. And this is kind of a key moment in that struggle to shift what has been going on for many decades.
And it's also like, I mean, that is the positive side of this. It's also just so unfortunate because in the process, there are these trained professionals who have college degrees, who've studied this, who are now no longer in the profession, and you can't rebuild that overnight. So it's important what you're saying, that it's like waiting till 2018 to sort of like reverse the de-investment is like too little too late in so many ways, because now you've lost like a whole almost like generation of people who aren't going to be teachers. And how do you even replace that? And I can't even imagine the stuff you guys have to deal with, because like on top of just, being like the punching bag whenever the country's like in chaos and disarray, like during the pandemic, it's also like these other weird political culture war issues that come up, like around critical race theory. Somehow teachers end up at the center of it, and you've got teachers just being attacked by like an entire news network and like getting certain parents all revved up to like blame teacher. It's just, I can't even imagine. It's like, I mean, this is me just ranting now too, but just the insanity that teachers in America in public education have to deal with. And, I have sisters who have kids, and then I hear them complain about like now their kids are, at really good public schools. Some of the best funded public schools in the country have class sizes of like 30 and more. That's like the situation. And you can't, like you said, like you can't repair that overnight. You can fix it, but it's hard. It's hard and it's difficult after like all these years. And I do hope that reverses. Are you like optimistic? I guess that's a good segue. And are you optimistic about reversing that trend? And then also for those who are watching, what can be done? Like what can your average person do? I know that's a kind of a hard question, but to help in that effort.
Yeah, I will say that I am optimistic. I am optimistic because there is that challenge that you named is real. Like we've lost so many educators that just aren't coming back into the profession, right? But there are still people coming into the profession. Many of our new hires, not ours, but the district's new hires, were brand new professionals who are finishing their credential program. So it's not that the stream is completely ended. It's that we're in a very challenging position in regards to, I guess, the moment that needs to take advantage of. This is not the time to cut education funding. This is not the time to resume the attacks on public education. It's the time to actually double, triple, increase our funding and look at it as a whole system-wide issue. So fund teacher credentialing programs, get teachers into the classrooms, recruit from the communities that our kids are in, like really take advantage of this moment to turn towards funding public education. And I guess what I would say is that the thing I said earlier, there's a reverse, right? Like when we're talking to people who talk about always knowing a teacher, people know a lot of educators, right? You're either, I mean, I'm a parent myself. We, as parents, we know we can connect with our educators. We know how to. It's sort of our first point of contact. And I would say that's key. Like communities have to come back together. And what we've seen from educators across the country since 2018, but since before really, but 2018 really changed it, is the idea that when we fight, and what we say is we're fighting for the schools our students deserve. When we fight, that's what we're fighting for. And that means that we need our voices of our families. We need the voices of the communities in these struggles to turn this tide. So I would say get involved. Like if you're in Columbus right now, go join a picket line, be out there, connect with the educators who are there as best you can. And I think that's the first step anyone can take to becoming part of what could be a potentially very strong movement.
No, I think that's a really, really strong point. And in a way, I don't want to preface it, but I mean, it does make me think a lot about, something that I think teachers unions have put out in a huge way here, this concept of bargaining for the public good and how, fighting for public education is really fighting for everything. And I think, certainly I know it's what you all do at UESF. It's been a big part of the Chicago Teachers Union, where this fight for public education has become part of a bigger fight for public social goods. And that, like, you know what I mean? And sort of the school as a pivot point for talking about what kind of society and what kind of communities do we really want to have. And that, to me, that feels like a powerful connection to make in terms of how, public education as a foundation for our societies is a big part of talking about the future.
Absolutely. And what we've talked about is part of bargaining for the common good, and it's almost an expansion of that, is that when we are talking about the schools our students deserve, we're talking about community schools. And so this means that these are schools where you're fully staffed. You have the counselors, the psychologists, the social workers, the amount of paraeducators you need to be fully present in the educational, academic, and social well-being of your students, but it's beyond that. It incorporates the needs of those students' families and the community around it. So in one of our community schools here, they set up a homeless shelter on campus for homeless families that needed a place to live. Community schools are becoming more and more popular across the country. You can look at a variety of different districts that have very established community school programs, and they have this incredible boost to the academic development of our students, because when our kids come in hungry, we can't start with math. We have to start with what do they need to eat. And when they're homeless, we don't even know how to address that, right? Like one educator, two educators in a classroom what can you really do? We do our best, but that's the sort of situation. So bargaining for the common good, bringing the community to the bargaining table. And there's been some incredible wins, like you said, in Chicago, also in LA, also in San Diego, and and Minneapolis and Boston is sort of moving towards that as well in pretty impressive ways. So we're seeing it, right? I think that's really what I was talking about, is how do we come together so that it's not just the community needs one thing, educators and students need another, but it's a holistic approach to ensuring that we really do meet the needs of our students.
Well, it's good to know that there are people out here in the front lines fighting for all of this, and we know our communities need a lot. Natalie Hrizi, public school teacher, public school librarian, vice president of substitutes for the United Educators of San Francisco. Thanks for all your work, and thank you for giving us some of your very valuable time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.